Hello travelers, welcome to Meta Slaves, where we talk about everything meta related in Genshin Impact. With Raiden's re-rank coming up in 4.3, a lot of you guys have been asking whether it's still worth it to pull for Raiden's Constellations, specifically her C2. Today, we're going to deep dive into this question, and hopefully by the end of the video, you'll have a more educated answer. Before we talk about whether or not you should pull for her Constellations, let's quickly go over her Constellations first. Her C1 lets her gain resolve stacks faster, which results in an approximately 5 to 10% personal damage increase, depending on her teams. It's an okay constellation, but not game changing by any means. Her C2, on the other hand, ignores 60% of enemy defense, which generally translates into a 40 to 45% personal damage increase, which is quite insane. Essentially, going from C0 to C2 will give Raiden a 50 to 55% personal damage increase, which is quite a bit for a C2 even in this day and age, let alone back in 2.1 when she first released. If she's hitting 100k with the initial slash with her burst at C0, she'll be hitting around 150k with her C2. And if you're going up to C3, that's another 18 damage increase on top of that, give or take. It is worth noting that her C2 ignores enemy defense and doesn't reduce enemy defense, meaning only Raiden herself will benefit from her C2 and not the rest of her team. This is different from Aika's C4, which decreases enemy defense by 30%, allowing the rest of your team to benefit from it as well. So, now that we know how good her C2 is, the question is it still worth pulling in 4.3? The answer to that question is, it really depends. So I personally have her C2, and I think the main selling point of her C2 is not only the damage increase, but the flexibility that it gives you when it comes to team building. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So I think it's fair to say that C0 Raiden is very dependent on Bennett for her personal damage, right? Without Bennett, her personal damage is a little bit on the low side. Damage that she gets from her C2 is basically equal to the damage that you get from a Crown Bennett burst, give or take depending on the team. So using that logic, having her C2 basically allows you to free Bennett from her team and potentially use him in another team that needs him instead. Now, obviously you're going to do even more damage with Bennett on top of her C2, but having her C2 allows you to do adequate damage without Bennett. So let's say you have Raiden as one of your on-field DPSs, and your other on-field DPS is, let's say, Navia, who also benefits from Bennett since she's an attack scaler. With her C2, you could put Bennett on Navia's team instead and still have adequate damage, clear 4 or 12 on Raiden, whereas if you only had her C0, it becomes much harder to do. Now, is it still doable at C0 without Bennett? Absolutely. It just becomes a little bit more of a struggle. And using a very extreme example here, the damage that she gains from her C2 basically allows you to retain her C0 damage while using a defense sense and a defense goblet. Now, you might be asking, why in the world would you ever do that? And I'm not saying this is something you should ever do, but it does put in perspective of how much of a damage increase her C2 is and how you can play around with the numbers. So again, using an extreme example, if we ever get a boss that hits for 20k damage, which is enough to one-shot Raiden in most cases, with her C2, you have the option of building some defense stats which allows her to survive that hit while still doing adequate damage. Again, this is just an extreme example to show what I mean by the flexibility that her C2 gives you when it comes to team building, and obviously it's not something that you should ever do. So does that mean Raiden C2 is a must-pull? Again, it really depends, and I think that's just the theme of this video right now. The answer is going to be different for everybody, and it really comes down to your account. So personally, I think you should only consider pulling for her C2 if you already have all of the core support characters, as well as a lot of versatility in your character box. By core support characters, I'm talking about characters like Furina, Nahida, Zhongli, Yelan, Kazuha. Maybe throw Kokomi in there as well if you play freeze teams. If you're missing any of those characters, or if you don't even have a proper second team for the Abyss, it's really hard for me to recommend Raiden C2 over those guys, because Raiden is already so strong at C0 and her C2 is really just a luxury. Right? It'll be a really inefficient way to spend your PRIMOGEMS. Now, say you already have those core support units on your team, and you already have 2 or 3 other teams that you're working with for the Abyss. The next thing you should look at is, what type of team are you looking to play with Raiden? As mentioned before, her C2 only increases her personal damage by 50%, so unless you're playing her in a hyper carry team, it's not going to translate into a 50% team damage increase. So if you're only mainly going to play Raiden in a national team where Raiden, Xiangling, and Xingqiu are all responsible for approximately a third of the team's damage, increasing Raiden's damage by 50% in this team will only lead to a 15 to 20% damage increase for your team. Similar situation if you're playing her in a Taser team with Yelan, Farina, and Jean. And if you're playing Hyper Bloom where she doesn't even use her burst, then her C2 is going to do absolutely nothing for you. So that's something that you should definitely take into account of and consider before splurging on her C2. Now, do keep in mind that her Hyper Carry team does have some weaknesses as well, such as being very electro heavy and not having the best shield breaking teams. But again, every team has their weaknesses, so I won't go too detailed into that in this video. Maybe that's something that we could talk about in the future video. So let's say you're pretty set on playing her Hyper Carry team, or you're totally okay with 20% damage increase to your national team. Okay, great. The next thing you should think about is how many pulls you can realistically save up by the end of her banner. Now, this is obviously a non-issue if you're willing to spend, but if you're a free-to-play player, ideally you don't want to pull her C1 and then run out of Primogems and be stuck at C1 for another year until her next rerun, because that's just a terrible use of resources. Now, assuming you already have her C0, the absolute maximum number of pulls that you need to get her C2, assuming 0 pity, is 360 pulls, but that's only if you're the unluckiest person in the world, right? Realistically, 320 pulls should guarantee you 2 copies of Raiden in the worst case scenario. Now, I'm going to put a little math for you on the screen in case you want to get a little bit risky. 240 pulls will give you approximately 85% of pulling 2 copies of her. 220 pulls will give you a 65% chance, which is what I'm personally comfortable with. Again, how much you want to risk it solely depends on your risk tolerance, but it's really hard for me to recommend pulling her Constellations without at least 200 pulls saved up by the end of her banner. So to recap this flowchart style, whether or not you should pull for Raiden C2 depends on, number 1, do you already have all of the core support units and a versatile character box? If the answer is no, then you probably should be saving up for those characters before considering Constellations. If yes, are you planning to play Raiden's Hypercarry team? And if not, are you okay with just a 20% team damage increase in her national team or Taser team? If the answer to that is yes, do you have enough pulls saved to comfortably get her from C0 to C2? And if the answer is yes to all of those questions, then by all means you should pull for her. As someone that has enjoyed Raiden C2 since her release, her C2 is definitely not something that you'll be disappointed with. Like I mentioned previously, her C2 really increases her ceiling as a character and gives her more flexibility when it comes to team building. If you were thinking of pulling for Raiden's Constellations, I hope this video made it easier for you to make your decision. If it's helped you, I really appreciate it if you like the video and subscribe for more content in the future. Good luck.